Hi, I'm Dr. Younger. I'm director of the Neuroinflammation, Pain, and Fatigue Laboratory. And today I want to talk about the loss of the sense of smell or the anosmia that many people experienced during or after a SARS-CoV-2 infection. And this was a loss of smell that can linger for a very long time after someone has been exposed to the virus. So I want to explain why it's happening, what's happening in the brain to cause this, what does it mean in terms of your recovery, especially if you're battling with long COVID, and what are the ideas for treating it. So the initial reports in kind of early to mid 2020 were that there was this odd symptom of COVID-19, and that was the loss of sense of smell. The scientific community and the medical community didn't really know what was happening, but it was so common that it was considered to be a marker of a COVID-19 infection. Now, when I first saw these reports, my first response was, oh no, I know what's going on here. This means the virus is in the nasal cavity and then it's breaching the brain through the cribriform plate and attacking the olfactory cortex in the brain. And so in June or July 2020, I released a video. It's still there back in earlier forms of my channel. I did a video stating that hypothesis that I think this loss of sense of smell means the virus is entering the brain through the top part of the nose. Now, at the time, it was only a hypothesis because it was at the very first of the pandemic and there was no scientific information at all. So I just wanted to mention that as what I thought was going on. Now we have a lot of supporting data that that is indeed what was happening. So let me show you how this works and why SARS-CoV-2 can cause you to lose your smell for such a long period of time. And so what you're looking at here is kind of a side view showing mostly the nasal system, the nasal cavity. So we've got the nose, of course. Then we have the nasal cavity. Up here is inside the skull is where the brain is. And in between the two is the cribriform plate, which is part of your skull that has these little holes in it. So I'm going to focus on that area. So inside the skull is the olfactory bulb, which is in yellow. And then you can see why those holes exist. They're to allow olfactory neurons to pass from the inside of the skull to the nasal cavity. And that's how we smell, because you have to have those free endings available in the nasal cavity to detect the chemicals that you breathe into your nose. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to smell. So that's how the olfactory system works. So we're going to zoom up here. So this is a really close up. You see the olfactory bulb still in yellow right here. Then we have the cribriform plate with those holes going through them. That's part of the skull. And then finally, we have these filaments, the endings of the olfactory neurons that allow us to detect the chemicals, which is the basis behind our sense of smell. Now, what's interesting here and important is that the olfactory neuron spans the length of that process. So it connects the brain to the nasal cavity, which is exposed to the outside environment. So this is a potential entry point for things into the brain. Now, there's several protective layers you might have noticed. I'm not going to talk about those, but there are protective layers to keep things from going into our nose and then going straight into our brain. We would not survive very long if that was the case. So the protective layers keep most things from entering the brain from the nose. But some things can take advantage of the neurons to enter the brain through the cribriform plate. Now, we use this with some medicines. So we have intranasal naloxone, which is an opioid antagonist. So you give someone an intranasal shot of naloxone, it'll enter the brain that route, and you can use it for an emergency opioid overdosing, like a heroin overdose or any opioid overdose, and it will very quickly reverse that overdose. We also have intranasal oxytocin, which is used in childbirth, and then there's intranasal insulin, which is used in emergencies and diabetic situations. And you do that when you want to give someone an intranasal shot and get it into the brain very quickly, usually in emergency situations. And so some chemicals, most don't, but some chemicals can reach the brain very easily through this route. Unfortunately, there are a few organisms that can hijack this route as well and enter the brain. You've probably heard of the amoebas, that people will be swimming and the amoebas are in the water and they take a big breath in, they suck the water into their nose. It's got some of the amoebas, and then they will enter the brain via the cribriform plate. There's some bacteria that can do that as well. And then we know now that SARS-CoV-2 can take advantage of that route as well. Now, once the SARS-CoV-2 has entered the brain, the microglia cells will change from their patrolling state to their fighting inflammatory state. And if you don't know what microglia are, you can check some of my past videos, and I explain them in several of the videos, but they're basically our brain's main defense. So the microglia will detect the SARS-CoV-2, adopt the inflammatory state, and start fighting off the virus by causing inflammation. And that assault, that first contact, is in the olfactory system. That's where the virus has entered. So that's going to be the site of most of that attack. So that's also going to be the site of most of the inflammation. Now, if the microglia are untrained, if they've never run across SARS-CoV-2 before, the response may be too slow and the virus may spread to other parts of the brain. But even if it does, the site of the greatest inflammation will probably be the olfactory system, just because, again, that's where the virus actually made its way into the brain. So why would you lose your sense of smell? Let's say that you've fought off the infection, you're mostly better, you're testing negative for SARS-CoV-2, so why would you still have a loss of sense of smell? Now, that's likely because the microglia have adopted a more permanent or a more constant inflammatory state in that place, in that olfactory cortex and olfactory bulb. And the reason they would do that is because that infiltration of the virus was such a threat to the organism, to you, to your brain, that the microglia stay in their inflammatory state to make sure that doesn't happen again. Unfortunately, when microglia stay in the inflammatory state, they interfere with the neuronal processes. And so they'll interfere with the functioning of your olfactory cortex. And so they'll prevent you from smelling things normally. So your sense of smell is probably not going to come back until your microglia have relaxed back into their patrolling state. They've moved out of their inflammatory state. So if you have had COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, and you still don't have your sense of smell back, that probably doesn't mean that your neurons have been damaged. It probably means that you still have inflammation in that part of your brain. And now we have really good evidence of that. So my colleague, Ayushi Sharma, uses the same neuroinflammatory scans that I do, and her group and Jerzy Slafarsky here at UAB has now shown, indeed, if you have long COVID, and it doesn't have to be a serious case, but if you have long COVID and you still don't have your sense of smell back, you have inflammation in your olfactory system. So here's the paper. I do believe this is an open access paper. You should be able to reach it. I'll put a link to it in the description. And it is brain temperature and free water increases after mild COVID-19 infection. And so what we're looking at here is the brains of 5 patients with long COVID and a loss of sense of smell. And what you can see here with every arrow is there's this little spot in the olfactory cortex where there's increased temperature. And again, if you've watched my earlier videos, you know that I'm really interested in increased temperature, because when it's in a specific location, like it is in this case, it usually means there's inflammation in that region. So these little colored spots are the places where there's increased temperature, indicating increased neuroinflammation. And so you can see that the brain overall isn't inflamed, but the olfactory cortex is. And this right here is kind of the average of all those patients. And this is in the primary olfactory cortex, which is exactly what we had hypothesized. So this means that basically you can't smell because your olfactory system is still inflamed. Your microglia are still in their inflamed state. So what do we do? Well, there's not a lot of research on treatments for the anosmia. Maybe part of that's because maybe it's not considered to be life-threatening, so it doesn't attract as much attention as other aspects of SARS-CoV-2. And also, the loss of sense of smell is less common with the newer infections. And that could be because the newer variants of SARS-CoV-2 don't enter the brain in the same way. And so they don't cause the loss of sense of smell. Or it could be that our immune system is doing a better job at preventing it. But regardless, there's not a lot of studies on how to get rid of this loss of sense of smell in particular. But we know that anti-inflammatories work for some people, such as the introduction of corticosteroids. Some people use low-dose naltrexone to try to relax the microglia back to their anti-inflammatory state. And then platelet-rich plasma has been used. I think the injections are in the nasal mucosa. I'm not 100% on that, but it's administered close to the site of the olfactory system. And what I would really like someone to do, I don't think it's ever been done, but I would love someone to use low-dose intranasal naloxone because, I work with low-dose naltrexone to reduce microglia inflammation. Naloxone has the same effects on microglia. So if we gave intranasal naloxone, it may relax the microglia right where we need it, but no one's done it. And also I want to warn people, I'm not talking about a full dose for opioid emergencies. I'm talking about a low dose of naloxone that I would hope would return the sense of smell. But anyway, someone would have to do that to see if it's actually worth doing. So anyway, if you know someone who's still suffering from this loss of sense of smell, at least we can tell them why this is happening. So I hope this is helpful. Spread this information. If someone's just, I know it can be really frustrating to have a symptom and not know what it means. And I think at this point, we're pretty comfortable in terms of knowing what's going on. I don't think it's a mystery much anymore. And in most cases, as the microglia gradually go back to normal, that sense of smell should come back. I don't know why it's faster in some people rather more than others. It could be genetic factors of how their microglia respond. There may be differences between men and women, or it could be just how much of the virus got into the brain in the first place. And we don't know, and we will probably never know the specifics, but some people will get the sense of smell back earlier. Some it'll take a little while. Some people it'll take longer. But as the microglia get back to their normal state, that sense of smell should come back. If it doesn't, then we're talking about chronic neuroinflammation, which is basically what all of my work is about. So if that's the case, then just continue watching the videos and we'll be talking about treatments that may help in that case. So do stay tuned into the channel. I will do another talk next week. My list of talk topics has now grown considerably. I've got so many topics I want to consider or I want to discuss. So there's lots to talk about. So I'll be back next week and get more information to you very soon. Thanks.